Welcome to the Self Reflections podcast, where real reflections are shared by real people. Today's episode is one that will truly stay with you. We're exploring the journey of overcoming binge eating disorder, trauma, and the darkness of suicidality, how deep pain can be transformed into powerful purpose. My guest today is Geena Hymer from Montana, USA, a courageous storyteller who has spent years navigating the complexities of eating disorders, trauma, and mental health. This conversation is raw, real, and nothing is off limits today. We'll be talking about the connection between trauma, binge eating, the impact of wounds, and what it truly takes to break free from cycles of shame and self-destruction. Whether you've struggled with an eating disorder, mental health battles, or simply need a reminder that healing is possible, this episode is for you. Geena, welcome to the Self Reflections podcast.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here today.
Before we dive in, can you share a little bit about yourself and what drew you to share your story with the Self Reflections audience?
Absolutely. I have long wanted to use my pain for a greater purpose. I definitely believe that that is in large part why we go through hardships. And I am also working on publishing my first book. And so, which is a lifelong goal of mine. And I feel there's so much, just a larger picture behind everything that has happened. And I want to be able to be the person to others that I needed when I was going through these hard times. So I'm here to live out my purpose.
And thank you so much, because I know it takes a lot for someone to come on a platform as wide as a podcast that is going to go around globally and be able to dive into the depths of their journey and their vulnerability as well. And I guess that's the point of our platform, is to be able to help others who may be struggling with difficulties to be able to connect with our guests and be able to see that there is hope in the journey, as well as through storytelling, we can provide people a bit of a framework or even a way to navigate through their challenges and difficulties. So on behalf of our community, I thank you, even this early on in our episode, for your vulnerability and for showing up for us.
Of course, I'm happy to do it.
Geena, your journey with binge eating disorder was deeply intertwined with trauma. Can you take us back to when your relationship with food started to change? And how did it show up for you in your life?
Yeah, my journey with starting to incorporate unhealthy eating habits started as early as the age of 8-9 years old.
Yeah, wow.
My folks, when I was 8, my folks decided to divorce, and that was something that I took really hard. And I didn't go into sitting down in front of a plate of food thinking, oh, this is going to make me feel better. It just turned out that I found that food became a comfort to me when I was having, sadness or anger or whatever kind of emotions I was trying to navigate. And so it started at 8 after my parents divorced. And then you flash forward a little bit to the age of 9. And at the age of 9, I started experiencing sexual abuse. And with that, I leaned even more into food because I'd already kind of uncovered the fact that it kind of soothed whatever I needed in a certain moment of emotion, like I mentioned. So I found, at that point I was like sneaking food or hiding food in my room to get comfort in those moments whenever they may have cropped up that I needed that warm hug, as I like to put it. So, it started so early on, and it continued for most of my life up until this point. But then my coping with the sexual abuse, I found myself looking for other ways to cope with that. I was put in a position to not be able to say anything to anybody about what was happening, simply because there were threats being made about harm that would come to others if I did. And so it wasn't safe for me to do so. Because I wanted to protect other people, and I just took it upon myself instead. And so my mental health definitely shifted during that time. And at such a young age, it's often hard for people to come to terms with how mental health can really downward spiral at such a young age, because you're so innocent and young, right? You haven't even begun to learn how to cope.
No.
But at the age of 9 is when I first attempted to take my life.
Oh, what a young age, Geena.
Yeah. Yeah. At the age of 9, or during the time of the abuse between like 9 and 11 years old, I attempted by trying to run into oncoming traffic 2 different times. And in the moment, you're looking for a way out, looking for a way to make whatever is happening stop. And of course, I was upset and angry in the moment because, but obviously today I'm incredibly grateful that, it didn't come to fruition.
Geena, thank you so much for even going into that much detail for our community to be able to connect with your story. When things happen to us, traumatic things, horrific things happen to us at a very, very young age, we have no capacity yet to understand how to cope with such things. And naturally, we turn to things that make sense and try and take the pain away. When we look at neurologically what happens in the brain under the impact of trauma, and also our need to self-soothe and our need to get rid of the pain, we just turn to things that are naturally going to connect to our brain's reward system, whether it's binge eating, suicide, self-harm, alcohol, gambling, porn, at whatever age, especially depending on when we turn to these to these methods. But especially at a very, very young age, the brain's just trying to make sense of the world. And because at that time, no one really teaches us how to take care of our nervous system, how to keep ourselves safe, we feel very much cornered and don't feel comfortable to be able to then self-soothe in ways that are actually healthy or kind, because again, no one's actually taught us that. No one brings a child into the world thinking that they're going to be assaulted or abused at that very young age. And sometimes parents, and I say this multiple times, we don't ever pass blame. No one would then consider that that is something that would need to be taught at that young age on how to self-soothe, how to, cope with traumas as they happen to us as we grow up. It only makes sense why you turned to food, to binge eat. When we binge eat, for example, especially as that was your earlier coping mechanism, because before you turned to not wanting to live, it releases dopamine. It's your feel-good neurotransmitter that actually temporarily soothes emotional pain. And even though this relief is short-lived, the shame that then follows through, not just with the binge eating, but then the trauma that then is happening, it only makes beautiful sense why individuals like yourself had to kind of one up, because binge eating sounds like it wasn't working. Well, it was, but it wasn't really, was it?
No, like you said, it's very much a temporary fix, if you will. And all the way through my adolescence and my young adult into my mid-20s or later 20s, actually, I was still grasping to try to find the best way to cope with things that, one, I didn't want to face and deal with in reality because it was just too painful. And, the binge eating got out of control in my 20s when, unfortunately, at a week before my first birthday, I ended up at a house party that my roommates and I were having, ended up being raped by an acquaintance at that party. And when that happened, it immediately took me back to my younger years because I hadn't even told anybody about the sexual abuse until my early 20s. And so, like I said, it took me back to that time frame, even more so because by the following morning, he was out in the general public bragging about his conquest the night before. And so to me, it again didn't feel safe to say anything because he had already put the narrative out there, his narrative about what really happened. And I was just kind of like, well, who's going to believe me? He's already told everybody what actually happened in his eyes. And, at that point, food became so heavily relied upon. And even before that point, I had already started to transition to other ways of trying to cope with the feelings I was having as they came up. I was, engaging in other acts of self-harm by cutting on myself because I was looking for a way to control the pain. And again, it's a short-term fix, but it feels right in the moment, as unhealthy as it is. So after the assault happened, I took it upon myself to really essentially build a body of armor. That's what all the food intake and the lack of self-care and things of that stemmed from, is I thought, and partially fed by society standards, which is nonsense, of course, but that if you look a certain way, you're not deemed attractive in a lot of society standards. So I took and ran with that and said, okay, well, I'm going to make myself really unattractive so that no one could possibly want to physically harm me again. And it affected, not just my relationships in general with, say, family and friends, but definitely my romantic relationships with men. I put up with a lot of mental abuse in relationships because I didn't have any self-value. And so because I didn't have any self-worth, they were then given an unspoken invitation to treat me poorly. So it was a very vicious cycle. And so over the course of it's maybe 8 to 10 years, I ended up putting on 160 pounds, and I wore it like a badge of honor, so to speak, because it was what needed to happen. And, I continued with other ways of harming myself. I attempted overdose multiple times. Like I said, I was lost and had no idea how to come to terms with tackling all of this past trauma while and doing so successfully in a healthy way.
And Geena, your story is so multifaceted. It's intertwining sexual assault at different ages, the trauma that brings, coping with mechanisms that are really hurtful, an eating disorder, and in a way, being a clinician that works predominantly with eating disorders and trauma, it's not surprising to me because majority of my clients have a similar story where it is intertwined within all of those. And just like you've identified, many, just like yourself, Geena, go through life minimizing and keeping what has happened in this darkness, in this secrecy, because of the shame that we feel, because of the inability to speak our truth, because of fear, and because we are so then connected with our coping mechanisms. When we use binge eating or suicide or self-harm or any type of mechanism to release pain, we have this bond and relationship with it because temporarily it does release pain, but it also then serves another function. And for you, it served this very common layer that if I make myself unattractive, if I hurt myself, if I create this wall and this barrier, then I will be safe. But in doing so, and as many of my clients and many people out there find, is that only then causes more harm, more trauma, more disconnection, not only from our communities, but the biggest disconnection is the disconnection we have from ourselves. And that can lead to even further harm because we're not attuned to our needs. We're not at all, we don't like being in our body. Our body has been hurt, it's been abused, it's not at all fun place to be in. So what ends up happening is we unconsciously make decisions for ourselves that just keep perpetuating harm and risk and trauma, which is a cycle that we then get stuck in. And it sounds like that's what happened to you, and it mimics so many of the stories that I hear in my therapy space, as well as other people who have experienced sexual assault and abuse as they grow up in childhood and adolescence.
Absolutely. I was stuck in this kind of on a hamster wheel for so many years. And, I didn't fully take control of my health, my physical health, until 10 years ago. And, I was finally at a place where something shifted in me, where I stopped utilizing means of self-harm to cope. And that my last attempt was at 28. So we're talking 18 years ago, which is something I'm incredibly proud of. what shifted for me in that moment was God intervened in that for me. So, I basically made a deal with him in that moment. I was sitting there in the middle of my living room of my apartment and just told him, okay, I'm going to reach out to a friend of mine by phone. And if she answers, I won't do it. But if she doesn't, I will. And I know for absolute certain that in that moment, he nudged her and said, whatever you're doing, you need to answer this call. And, she didn't fix the situation or anything like that, but she listened to me. I felt heard in that moment. And that's a big part of it is one, finding people that you find are safe people to go to, because unfortunately, there's a lot of people that we will find are not. Even those that we want to be our safe space can't necessarily be. And it's not necessarily because they don't have a care or concern about it. They're just not equipped to. And we have to remember that as well. But she was what I needed in that moment to save my life.
And it's so great that you were able to get to a point in your journey that it was like this make or break. And at times when we finally make that decision, whatever way that it gets created or how it then paves itself, it's that pivotal moment many people can describe in their journey that it was the first day that I actually believed that I can get out of what I've been through.
It was, yeah, there was a little bit of clarity. There were still many years of struggling, and not, like I said, not with the self-harm piece, but definitely still with the food aspect. That was very hard to shake. It's kind of like when I got to a point where I decided to improve my physical health. It was something I was very determined to do, but it was also very uncomfortable. And the respect that I knew that it would create people to look at me differently. And I had become so accustomed to kind of being invisible that I didn't like having the attention. And I still don't necessarily like having attention, but it's something I have to, really kind of work on pretty much daily to just be okay with being seen.
But first, a word from our sponsor. Welcome to Self-Reflections, real people, real reflections. Whatever you're carrying, you don't have to do it alone. We're not just your average service. A space to come home to yourself one session at a time. A sanctuary where you feel seen, heard, and held. We meet you where you are, online or in person. Providing support across the lifespan from little ones to adults. Nurturing your mind, body, and relationships. Real people, real reflections. Book now at selfreflections.com. The way that an eating disorder can really wriggle its way and make you feel like you don't want to be seen, you don't want to be heard, you want to kind of stay in the shadows. And I want to take this opportunity to discuss a little bit about what binge eating is for those in our community that might not really understand. And binge eating is actually quite often misunderstood. Many people think of eating disorders as restrictive only, but binge eating disorder is, I believe, just as, if not more, distressing and extremely risky, given its actual complexity. So much attention and focus is on anorexia, and I'm not saying at all I'm battling each disorder against each other. But many of my clients who have a binge eating disorder often find that there is limited research or limited resources that can help them understand the complexities of this disorder. And it does have flavors of anorexia through it. And this is what eating disorders I want to share with our community. There's so much overlap and there's so much interconnectedness that occurs with eating disorders that we find ourselves just kind of only providing care or even seriousness to an eating disorder that is very, very prominent, like something like an eating disorder, under eating disorder, sorry. Because when we look at something like anorexia, especially if there is significant weight loss, people get care a lot quicker and people start to get curious or they start to get concerned for the individual. With something like a binge eating disorder, it goes unrecognized for such a long time because people's weight can naturally fluctuate. And as weight is increasing at times for some people, I do have clients that aren't reporting any overweight complexities with their binge eating disorder. But unless someone is very, very rapidly changing in their body type, people often minimize that something is actually wrong. Not only people who are the strugglers of an eating disorder, but it's also the community around them. They don't actually start to put one-on-one together in realizing this is actually really an eating disorder that's really, really complicated and challenging. So I wanted to throw that back to you because everyone experiences binge eating disorder specifically in a different way. Can I ask you, what were the symptoms that you were experiencing? And did it start to morph as you got older and as more trauma then happened in your life?
Absolutely. And first, I just want to say I really appreciate you really kind of navigating that. You did that very beautifully because there is so much, research and information out there and support for the restrictive side, but there really is not so much for the overeating side. And even though they both can create such a vast difference in someone's appearance from one extreme to the other, there's also from someone who has gone through this, from the perspective of someone who has walked this, there seems to be more acceptance behind the restrictive versus the other, because that's why there's, and I can't speak to the restrictive side to see, as to how that walk feels, but I know from the binge eating side, it does come with an enormous amount of shame because you're seen as lazy or, whatever it may be, without people understanding that there may be something underlying it, whether it's, actually having an issue with food or even medical reasonings in some cases. So thank you for that, because that's just so important for people to hear, even those that have gone through it or have not. For me, it did evolve over time, because from my young age through, high school, I stayed, obviously I gained weight over the years and stuff like that, but I stayed really steady, say like the 4 years of high school. And it wasn't until after the sexual assault happened right before my first birthday that I just went all in with, not caring what I was eating, not thinking about what I was consuming, not caring about who I was or what I looked like or anything like that, and I would go out to, meals with people I knew and stuff like that. For the most part, I was very self-aware of how I was eating in front of other people, to try to keep any judgment or comments at bay. But there were instances over the years where people would be like, oh, are you going to eat all that? Where, we need to understand we don't have a say-so. Like, keep those thoughts to yourself. It's none of our business how much someone wants to eat, right? And so I would be the good girl, as I say, and I would, box half of it up and I'd take it home to save face or whatever in front of them. And on the way home, I'd stop and get fast food and junk food and all of those things. And I'd go sit in my personal 4-wall setting and I'd eat the rest of the dinner from the night. And then I'd eat everything I picked up as well, just to spite them, so to speak, so a lot of people around me may not have fully understood how I was gaining so much weight so fast because they weren't seeing the reality of what I was consuming. But of course, I didn't want them to either. So it is very complicated. And like I said, the level of shame that comes along with it, because you're beating yourself up because you can't seem to control what you're eating. And you beat yourself up because, you don't fit a certain mold, or, layers upon layers of reasons to feel bad about yourself.
A quick note before we continue. We experienced a brief technical issue during this session. While we managed to reconnect and save the conversation, the software gave us a few surprises, mismatched clips, no split screen, and yes, my voice sounding like a chipmunk. I decided to share it anyway, because this conversation is just too good not to. Thank you for sticking with us. The message and meaning are what matter most. Now, let's jump back in.
What I want to distinguish a little bit for our community, as you were mentioning that, is the difference between a binge eating disorder and bulimia. Some people have a misconception because there is an overeating component in both of those. So binge eating disorder is the excessive intake of food as a coping mechanism in the absence of any overcompensatory behaviors like purging, vomiting, or exercising. Binge eating disorder is using food as a comfort to try and release pain and the discomfort and regulate the nervous system in the body. And in doing so, what happens is it's not just overeating in one, meal at the time that you eat it. There is a difference between I overate and what we would then consider a full-blown binge. And I want to highlight that, and I'm sure that you can, Geena, give a little bit more information. It's the intake of food in an excessive manner, more than what you would have as just one meal of that sitting. And it's this constant overeating without the connection to your satiety or fullness cues that your body would naturally give you, in hope that that food will actually take away the pain, the shame, the discomfort, the dysregulation that many of us at times feel. Can you confirm or deny whether that was something that was specific to your binge eating disorder?
100%. I mean, it was as though I was a bottomless pit. You know, you might think that you can just eat until the point of being absolutely sick to your stomach. Very seldomly did I get to that point. It's like there was no end in sight.
And I also want to add into here is the reason why binge eating disorder is so risky is as we use binge eating as a coping mechanism, we push our stomach bit by bit by bit, and it actually grows. As we continue to engage in overeating, the stomach itself actually stretches and stretches and stretches. What we don't realize though, and this is what's really, really risky about having a binge eating disorder to this level, is as the stomach actually stretches, it creates parts of the stomach that are weak and can actually pierce and puncture, or I don't want to say puncture, it can rip, I guess, internally. And this is why binge eating disorder is so risky, because we don't know when, what parts of our stomach have actually weakened, and when that moment will be, when there could be a rupture of the stomach, which could then be very fatal for individuals without them even realizing that their next binge can actually result in their death. And I know that that's a very morbid way of us discussing this, but there is a really significant risk that at times communities don't highlight the real and considerate risk of binging to a point where your stomach can actually then break.
That is incredibly true. That's not something, of course, that I thought about in the midst of my consumption, because all I had on my mind was, okay, just keep burying and layering on top of all these feelings that I did not want to deal with. And so, that's even helpful to me because I don't think I've ever had anybody quite explain to me that I could essentially have broken my stomach. I knew that what I was doing wasn't technically deemed healthy, but in the moments like I said, that was not even a factor for me.
It's really interesting that even someone who has experienced binge eating disorder and has come to a state of recovery, that this is the first time that you are being told of this risk, which highlights my exact point of this actually being something that is underreported. People are undereducated, and I really want to, as hard as it is to hear it and to even share it on a platform like this, I want our community to be aware of risks when they are engaging in certain things. So, I really do appreciate even you being open about the fact that this wasn't something that you were informed in your journey previously.
Absolutely. I mean, education is power, right?
Geena, you've spoken about sexual trauma and the many challenges that brought. It obviously played a role in your struggles with food and mental health. How did those experiences shape the way you viewed yourself and your body?
I did not have any value in how I looked. I very much struggled with any kind of acceptance with myself and how I appeared. There's been many times over the years where I would literally go through everything in my closet to try to find something that I felt actually comfortable leaving the house in. And I would end up in just tears because I would end in a full-on panic attack because I did not want to leave the house for fear of being judged because I didn't like how I looked. And I honestly had to take some mental health days over the years for that exact reason, which is, I guess even kind of hard to say in this moment that it was so crippling at times in the lack of value in the beauty I actually have at any shape or size. And, I can only appreciate that more so now. And I'm still on my recovery journey. I still struggle to this day at times. And I feel it's something I will always have to navigate in one way, shape, or form. So
we know about sexual trauma, Geena, is it has as you might know for your experience as well, is it has a completely profound impact on body image and eating disorders. Survivors often experience a disassociation where it's a psychological defense mechanism where the mind completely disconnects from the body to avoid overwhelming emotions. And when we then look at the correlation between any form of sexual trauma and eating disorders, this disassociation can actually lead to body hatred, self-punishment through food, deprivation, binging, purging, self-harm, like you previously mentioned, even a desire to numb out from bodily sensations, which binge eating can temporarily provide. And when we then connect that to eating disorders, there is such a correlation when especially the body has been treated poorly. Trauma survivors will naturally then use food or the lack thereof as a form of coping and a sense of punishment. And it got nothing to do with vanity or dieting or being lazy or not caring about the body. Our interconnectedness with our view of our body and food specifically, it's all about survival and it's all about self-protection. And I want to highlight that. I know earlier you were mentioning about these messages that you were getting from the community, whether they were self-perceived messages or actual direct messages, but that you were lazy or that you were seen as lazy. It's got nothing to do with that.
Yeah, you touched on how, we end up feeling perceived a certain way. And there was something you had said, and I can't quite remember what it was, but it triggered a thought in me that, I even took my relationships, my physical relationships with men in some instances. I found that within some of those relationships, something about either the way that they spoke or acted or whatever it may have been was some sort of a trigger as I've kind of worked through the healing process of things. And I would even in some of those situations have to shut myself down emotionally just to be able to be intimate with them, and that was a way to protect myself as well, because what they were saying was causing me harm, but still wanting to have that connection. with them in a different way. And there were times where it kind of almost scared me in some sense that I had that capability to shut down emotionally, because that's not something you want to do when you're in a relationship with somebody. But it's definitely hindered relationships for me. And some of those left me feeling like I still wasn't safe.
Yeah. And what you've described there is exactly what the coping mechanism of disassociation is, right? It's whether or not it was a safe relationship or not safe relationship, the act of then being close to someone and then being, whether it be intimate with you or close to you, or where your body is then at risk of just being seen, even if it isn't in a unhealthy way, you flip out of your capacity to be present. And that occurs because your body has made to be, prior to that, was made to fear any of that closeness. And anytime you were in your body, it got hurt. So it's best then to flip out of it, irrespective of whether it's a positive or negative experience, because at a certain point we stop then controlling the disassociation, and it then happens at any time as a mechanism just in case. So many individuals who have had trauma, especially sexual trauma, they will describe that they don't like being in their body, because when I'm in my body, it doesn't feel good. I have to face my shame. I have to face all the emotions and the disgust I have for myself or what I've been through. And of course, it's the best way to be able to survive and be resilient and keep going through life and coping, if that makes sense.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. That's very well put. Thank you.
Geena, tell me when was the pivotal moment for you? Because you've described such a long journey of trauma and hardship and self-punishment and self-harm, suicidality. When was the turning point for you where you felt like something did need to change? You did mention that there was that moment of turning to God and calling on your friend. And tell us what then happened after that. What did recovery look like for you?
At that specific moment, I did, like we talked about, started leaning more into my faith, but yet I still was not at a point where I was fully ready to work through and heal things. So he was still at arm's length. And so was my interest in fully healing myself. That didn't come for a few more years, actually. But the real pivotal turning point for me was 10 years ago. I unexpectedly had to fly on a plane to go to my grandmother's funeral. And this is at a point where I was at my heaviest, and I didn't want to be flying in at all. And I certainly didn't want to be flying for a funeral. And I found myself on both the flights headed down to that funeral in a situation where I was shamed for my size and humiliated, and because I was encroaching on someone else's space. And I had never quite navigated anything quite like that before, where someone was making a scene because they were seated next to me and they weren't comfortable and asking to be seated elsewhere. And so I was incredibly enraged and mortified in those moments. And I unfortunately sat there and took it in both instances because I didn't want to draw even more attention to the situation. But I was just on the verge of tears. Like, I had never been so humiliated in my life, because I didn't want to be encroaching on their space either. It's just, that was my body composition. And I just so happened to have the middle seat. And, you couldn't even put the armrest all the way down, right? And that was a problem for the person sitting next to me. And so leading up to that, though, I had kind of been really thinking hard about what can I do to start finally healing myself from both a mental aspect and a physical aspect. And knowing that I had such an issue with overeating, I knew I needed a tool to utilize to help me with my ability to eat so much. And so after those two humiliating instances, I solidified my decision in moving forward with bariatric surgery to help with the food restrictive side, but in a monitored medical way. And so when I got back from my grandmother's funeral, I scheduled an appointment with a surgeon. And 2 days after my 35th birthday, I had a rebirth, as I call it. And I had my surgery, and I prepared myself mentally for that because a lot of it is mental. You do have to change your eating habits, clearly, but you also have to be willing to work through the underlying reasons. And so within a year, I ended up losing all 160 pounds I had gained all those years. And that came with its own set of challenges in some ways as well. Because I don't always see the progress. And I have had a little bit of regain over the course, because this is my 10-year anniversary this year from the surgery. And some regain is perfectly normal, but I'm not where I want to be. So, but I still don't always see how far I've come. So there's almost that dysmorphia aspect to it as well. I kept one pair of my original britches so that when I am not seeing the true progress and the hard work that I've made, I can pull those out and visually see, which does help. I like to say I feel like it's more 90% mental than it is anything else going through that process.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask, because some people do go down the avenue of bariatric surgery, and my clients who know that work with me know that I'm one not for it, just because of the lack of support that anyone, especially in Australia, I'm not sure what the system is like in America, but in Australia, people who go and undergo the surgery, there's not a lot of prep time or work, and many surgeries then fail. And the person who had undergone the surgery has a lot of complications because the surgery doesn't solve the eating disorder. The eating disorder is not just your overeating, like you said there, Geena. It's this mental component to it. It's being able to break apart the shame, break apart or work through the trauma, be able to work through, underlying beliefs of defectiveness and disgust and those years and years and years of pain that we then, and punishment we put on ourselves. And many individuals, and I love that you were able to get to your 10-year anniversary and can see such a kind of amount of work that has then helped you get to where you are today. So many individuals go into the surgery thinking that it's going to be their golden ticket. And I want to acknowledge that definitely is a aspect of what the journey can look like, but it's not going to work without the underlying work that you have to do on your trauma, on your hatred for self, on your worth, on your self-esteem, that is then going to help a surgery like that be actually effective years later. Because many individuals go and do the surgery very quickly without any support. And I'm speaking to some of the clients that I've had come through the door after surgery had already occurred, and they have had so many complications because their binging continued post-surgery. And so much damage has then occurred internally to their stomach, their esophagus, and it just spirals so quickly out of control. So I wanted to take this opportunity to kind of just put a little point in there to say that if you are going to go down an avenue to do bariatric surgery, to be able to ensure that you have a very good clinical team around you, that you actually put in the work, the mental work, and the emotional work that needs to happen before that is something that you go and do, to ensure that if you go and do a surgery, that it's actually going to be as successful for you as possible.
1,000%. I know it's not the right fit for everybody, and I would never recommend it to anybody unless they are fully ready, because you're setting yourself up to fail if you don't. And that's an expensive failure in a lot of ways. Yeah. And even like you mentioned, even post-surgery, you can still binge. It just looks different. So, it's not a golden ticket. It's not going to fix all your problems. It comes with its own set. And I don't know that all surgery offices even do a pre-surgical psychological evaluation to make sure that you are prepared. My surgeon's office did, and they're doing a grave disservice to their patients if they don't do that. You have to be able to identify who is and is not ready.
Absolutely. So then, 10 years on, I know you were mentioning to me in our discovery call that you're currently working on a memoir about your journey. What was this process of writing and reflecting on your story, and how was that for you in looking back after so many years?
You know, the book itself is still a work in progress. I'm still working on it, and it has had some good and bad moments. You know, because you have to relive some of these situations in order to write about them. Well, you have to relive all of them, actually. But, you know, depending upon how far you are in your healing, you know, it can set you back further than it might others. You know, it's been both continually healing. And when it does become too hard to write about something, I have to respect myself enough to step away, even if that sets back my deadline for publishing for my own mental health. And, you know, honestly, before I sit down and write every session, I say a simple prayer in that, you know, I ask God to guide my writing for me. And he's actually guided me to write about things I had no intention of writing about. So, you know, it's evolving, but it's also, to me, it's making it better because it's driven in the right way to get to the right audience, to get the right message out there. So, but it has been painful at times, to be honest.
What do you hope readers can take away from your memoir?
The biggest takeaway for me is really making sure that whoever is taking the time to read my experiences can have a greater understanding of the cause and effect of traumas, because it looks differently for everybody, but it can also look similar. But also, I really just want them to feel like their experiences have been heard and acknowledged and that they are not alone. Because when you're walking through that season yourself, it's so hard to feel like anybody else can relate to you.
Once it's something that you'll be able to release, I'm sure that there'll be so many beautiful messages because of that lived experience that you have that others can connect to and find commonalities to then help them through their challenges.
Yeah, and I want to be really intentional not to trauma bond with anybody either. You know, it's not about that. It's just being relatable.
What other aspects of, I guess, healing are important in someone not only recovering from an eating disorder, but also recovering from trauma and suicidality? What were some of the other things that you engaged in that were, I guess, pivotal things for your recovery?
For me personally, it was, I actually put myself in therapy when I was 18 because I knew I had things I needed to work through. But it took me all the way up until just in the last 4 to 5 years to find the actual right fit for me from a therapy standpoint, because, you know, it's not a one size fits all. Everybody has a different way that they need to be approached and also be able to communicate with their therapist. So, you know, most of my years were spent in where I did all the talking, but I didn't have a lot coming back to me. And I found for me personally, that's not what worked well for me. And that works great for a lot of people, because I know a lot of people who have successfully gone through therapy in that styling. Me, I have found with my current therapist that, you know, I need somebody who's not going to sugarcoat anything for me. They're going to hold my feet to the fire, draw stuff out of me, make me really do the work, give me homework, you know. And so that has really helped tremendously. And it's led me to be able to have some really courageous conversations with really important people in my life. Conversations that were very long overdue because I never felt in the right space to be able to have them. So I've done a lot, like a big chunk of my healing in the last 5 years.
Yeah, and it's interesting you highlight that. When we go through therapy at different stages of our life, we are a different person at 18, you mentioned, was your first attempt at therapy, to when we are in our late 20s, 30s, even 40s. You're going to naturally be ready to hear different things at different times. And it's interesting that you know, ebbed and flowed through different types of therapies with different types of therapists. And I'm so glad to hear that you kept at it, because it is something that you're going to get different things from different therapy styles as well as therapists, but you're going to be different at different stages of your life. So what you need at the age of 18, in your 20s or 30s or even later is going to be different. Being able to understand that about your journey, that, you know, even in the last 5 years, I'm also wondering, were you at a point where you were so ready to receive and so ready to do the work, where prior to that there was probably aspects of it, but a lot of things probably had to kind of, the foundations had to get built for us to then be able to fully face it. And you're right, like, different therapy styles are going to suit different clients. For me, I know that if, you know, I have to at times start with more of like a gentle and slow and putting our foot into the trauma and stepping back out and nurturing and taking care of clients. Whereas, you know, once that rapport gets built and once the confidence to kind of face it starts to grow within the person, it's not to say easier, but you're ready to do the harder work. You're ready to face it. Is it going to be easy? Absolutely not. Is it still going to be challenging? Yes. Will you get activated? Absolutely. That's the point of trauma work. But I think, you know, if you just dump someone into facing their trauma right off the bat, you know, especially when we're really young, when we've never really learned how to regulate our nervous system or been able to get any guidance, it is something that's going to make us feel so overwhelmed that we won't come back to therapy. So it's interesting that you actually laid out your journey in that way. And I wanted to add to that and normalize that, you know, sometimes you do need to go through the foundational building, the strength building, to be able to actually do the really, really hard work that trauma does require of us when we are ready to actually do it.
Definitely. I walked into so many different therapy sessions, you know, just kind of going through the motions, because like I said, I was not in a place to really want to do the work, even though I know I needed to do the work. And, you know, over the years, you go through even more different types of life and lived experiences. And so, you know, for me personally, it just kind of came to me that, you know, I've been through all this past trauma in my young years, my early 20s. Then you factor in all the relationships that I'd had over the years and why those didn't succeed. You know, it's like I knew I had to dig in and do the work for so many different reasons. And I just got to a point where I didn't want to live with that unresolved feeling anymore. I knew it was holding me back. And so even if, you know, others that are listening or whomever, if it's not an outside therapist that you're leaning on, it's important that you at least find, like I mentioned very early on in our conversation, find those safe people. And even if that's just one person, you know, but especially when it's tied to trauma or binge eating disorder, you need to have someone who is a safe space to go to without judgment.
I agree. I believe that when there is trauma and when there is especially an eating disorder, it's very hard to do the work on your own. Why? Because you are so enmeshed with, you know, the things that are trying to keep you safe, but they're actually hurting you at the same time. You need someone to be able to pull you out of it, because your relationship with your disorders are so strong. You don't see life without them because they've been around for such a long time. You have a loyalty to them. So I love that you've identified there, and I've shared this in so many of our other episodes. If you don't or can't access therapy for whatever reason, please go to individuals who may understand. They don't necessarily need to fix it, but they are the ones that are able to give you their hand and pull you out of what you're going through just for a moment, for you to be able to then do some of the work yourself. But it is not, this work cannot be done on your own. You know, you have to have good people around you, because I often say that the eating disorder is like an abuser, just pulling us right back and keeping us in the shadows to itself. We need other people in our world to be able to pull us away from the grips of that.
That's an excellent way to put it. Yeah.
The thing about a story like yours, Geena, is there's so much depth in each of the points that you have, experienced or endured. And while I want to acknowledge that each one of these topics we can do a completely separate episode on, and for our community listening, if there are any questions or any struggles or challenges that you're going through that you would like Geena and I to flesh out a little bit more, where we do just an episode on trauma or just an episode on, eating disorders or suicide, if you actually want us to really, really sit in that space and expand it on a more in-depth manner, please let us know. And I will be able to then get in touch with Geena so that we can bring more episodes to you as our community, because I guess with that education and awareness, we can then create changes and provide that knowledge. And just like Geena mentioned earlier, she didn't know about the risk of ongoing binging, and I'm wondering whether you guys knew that as well. And if there's any questions or anything else we can bring to the platform, please let me know in the comments below, and Geena and I can reconnect and maybe do an episode for you guys in the future.
I wholeheartedly agree. I mean, I'm on board to help others continue to heal in whatever way I can.
Geena, your journey is incredibly powerful. And looking back, what has been the greatest lesson you've learned about healing and self-acceptance?
Oh, wow. I would say just really being more in tune to what I need to heal and being respectful of those moments as they come up, instead of, trying more to just push them down, which is a very bad old habit that, still likes to rear its ugly head from time to time, but just really being more accepting of both my past, my present, and whatever my future may hold has been key for me.
It's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. And where can people connect with you and follow your journey?
Currently, they can follow me on both my Instagram and my Facebook under my first and last name, Geena Hymer. And I am working on getting a website put up, which will be the same, geenahymer.com. I'm keeping it very simple. And, I share tidbits of my writing, share other podcast episodes that I'm doing. I'm pretty transparent. So, if people want to connect with me on either of those platforms, that would be awesome. I'd love to hear from them.
And as always, I will have Geena's details in the description below for you all to connect with her. Geena, thank you so much for your raw and vulnerable story on the Self-Reflections podcast today.
You're welcome, Klaudia. Thanks for having me on.
And for our community, thank you for tuning into the Self-Reflections podcast. If you found value in today's episode, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below to share your thoughts. Until next time, take care and keep reflecting.